There is a voice that tells you to go to the gym, and a voice that says the couch is fine. There is a part of you that wants to be honest, and a part that finds deception easier. There is the person you are at your best, generous, patient, focused, courageous, and the person you sometimes become under stress, petty, reactive, avoidant, afraid. If you feel these internal contradictions acutely, if the war inside sometimes feels louder than anything happening outside, William James has something important to tell you. James called this experience the divided self, and he explored it with extraordinary depth in The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902. His core observation was this: many people experience their personality not as a unified whole but as a collection of competing tendencies, impulses, values, and desires that do not cohere. They feel genuinely torn, not between two options in the world, but between two versions of themselves. This experience has a long history in literature and philosophy. St. Paul described it as the war between flesh and spirit. Robert Louis Stevenson dramatized it as Jekyll and Hyde. Freud would later theorize it as the conflict between id and superego. But James approached it as a psychologist and a phenomenologist. He wanted to describe what it actually feels like from the inside, not explain it theoretically from the outside. What he found was that the divided self is not, as many people assume, an aberration. It is an extremely common human experience, perhaps even a necessary developmental stage for certain kinds of profound growth. The division, James observed, typically arises when a person's actual life, their habits, their relationships, their daily choices, has drifted significantly from their deepest values. They believe one thing and live another. They know who they want to be and find themselves acting like someone else. The psychological cost of this division is enormous. James described it as a state of chronic inattention, a sense of not being at home in one's own skin, a persistent background exhaustion that no amount of sleep seems to cure. Modern psychology recognizes this experience in concepts like cognitive dissonance, value-behavior inconsistency, and identity confusion. The divided self is not a metaphor. It has measurable psychological and even physiological costs. So what causes it? James identified several sources. Sometimes the division is between instinctive desires and social norms, between what we want and what we believe we should want. Sometimes it is between different social roles that make incompatible demands, the professional who must be ruthless competing with a parent who must be loving. Sometimes it is deeper, a conflict between two fundamental orientations to life, two possible versions of the self that are genuinely incompatible and that cannot both be fully expressed. James was particularly interested in this last kind of division, because he believed it was often the precursor to the most dramatic and positive personal transformations. He observed that in many cases, the divided self is a soul in the process of outgrowing one identity and struggling toward another. The old self, the habits, the commitments, the self-concept built up over years, resists the new. The new self, the emerging values, the changed vision, the different way of being, insists on being born. Between them, war. The resolution of this war, when it comes, is what James called unification. And he was struck by how often this unification was experienced not as the gradual victory of one side over the other, but as a sudden shift, a moment when the tension broke, when the competing voices became one, when the person finally knew who they were. This is what he meant by conversion, in the broadest psychological sense, not necessarily religious conversion, but the reorganization of the self around a new center. Modern therapy has developed sophisticated tools for working with the divided self. Internal family systems therapy, developed by Richard Schwartz, treats different internal voices as genuine subpersonalities, each with their own needs, fears, and valid perspectives, and works to integrate them through compassionate inner dialogue rather than suppression. This maps remarkably well onto James's framework. The goal is not to silence the dissenting voices but to bring them into relationship with each other under the leadership of what James called the spiritual self. For anyone currently experiencing the exhaustion of inner division, James offers both validation and direction. The division is real. The conflict is painful. But it may also be a sign that you are in the middle of becoming something new, that the self you were can no longer contain the self you are trying to become. The work is not to suppress either voice, but to listen to both honestly and ask what each is trying to protect, what each is trying to create. Integration, when it comes, is not the elimination of complexity. A unified self is not a simple self. It is a self in which the different voices have found their proper relationship to each other, where the passionate and the disciplined, the playful and the serious, the private and the public selves are no longer at war but in conversation, each contributing what it does best to the whole. James knew this territory from the inside. His own inner life was characterized by profound tension and hard-won integration. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James and explore more of his honest, courageous, and deeply human psychology.